Hi, everyone. Halloween is just around the corner. And if there's one thing I can tell you you should be wary of at this scariest time of year, it's the YouTube algorithm, which can lead you to waste many, many hours of your time. One of the things that popped up on my YouTube feed the other day was a homemade documentary about the history of black metal and the band Mayhem in my first reaction was, oh yeah, those guys, the Satanist Nazi church burning guys. Uh, these are events that happened in the late 1980s and early 1990s before the interwebs took hold of our lives. So they were events that were more fabled than followed. And although the peak of the insanity around those events made the international news and found its way all the way to various stops in Bloomington, Indiana, Madison, Wisconsin, and even Cincinnati, Ohio, it was so shrouded in mystery due to the limited nature of news coverage at the time that I never really got to the bottom of it. And I was entering a period in my own life where rock and roll and related musics were becoming less of an interest, and I never really followed up. So I watched the documentary the other day, and it was quite fascinating and sent me down the black metal rabbit hole in some detail. There's a Hollywood film about those events called Lords of Chaos. It's a deeply flawed and disappointing movie. They've done a good job of visually recreating the feel of things, but it's got a really clumsy and amateurish use of voiceover, which kind of ruins pictures like that for me, especially when the character doing the voiceover is dead. It always seems a bit contrived and juvenile, a bit like the writers weren't sure which direction they would go in. But nevertheless, it's a compelling story. And again, there's always rabbit holes within rabbit holes. I went on to discover that one of the authors of the book on which the movie is based is himself kind of a weird, dark, right-wing neo-Nazi character with long ties to Boulder, where I work every year. But ultimately, it's the story of Mayhem, the sort of founding fathers of black metal and the bands around them in those early years that I find most interesting and in many ways very familiar. Familiar because what they're about is extremeness and darkness in music and art. And this is not something that they invented by any means. Another thing that they're very much about is archetypes, and I think that's one of the reasons that their legend has stuck in the creative consciousness over the years, is that we see in the various characters within the band and the scene around them familiar archetypes. Euronymous, aka Oystein, the sort of founding father of Mayhem, whose murder kind of climaxes and closes the first very dark chapter of those years, is a quintessential polemicist in the best tradition of someone like Pierre Boulez, who understands that when dealing with extreme art and trying to make an extreme impact on audiences, the rhetoric and discourse around it can have a lot to do with that. So for Oystein, it was not only a question of making extreme art, but describing extreme art, demanding extreme art, and demanding an extremity of response to the art that he was interested in making. This had consequences that were unintended as well as those that he hoped for, ultimately leading to his murder, which closed this early chapter. His murder took place at the hands of a man who called himself Count Grishnak, a name lifted from the Lord of the Rings, also called himself Varg Vikernes. And he was a very talented musician who came onto Oystein's radar after Mayhem had been together for a while and played on their last project during Oystein's life, their official debut album. He played bass. But he also played in a one-man band called Burzum, which he played all the instruments on and sang in. And Varg is believed to be the ringleader of the series of church bombings and fires that became part of the legend of early black metal. He most definitely murdered his friend Oystein, stabbing him dozens of times in the head, neck, and back with a knife. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison for murder. Varg seemed to embody another kind of an archetype, one who is the artist who wants to embody the extremity of the art that they're creating. In his case, very dark. He was a man who wanted to act where Oystein wanted to speak, and that compulsion to act led him to commit horrible, horrible, monstrous acts. And he's remained a very, very dark character since his release, with a very pessimistic, nihilistic view of the world. He would, I think, say that to a certain extent this is a matter of simply walking the walk, where, in his view, perhaps Oystein only talked the talk. Then there's someone like Necrobutcher, the bass player in Mayhem, who seemed to be able to keep something of a wall between himself and the art that they were making. He believed in extreme music. He wanted to create extreme music. He's sort of gone on to carry the flag for the modern version of Mayhem as a band, and yet he didn't really want any part of the actual death, violence, and lived darkness that some of his colleagues wanted. So in fact, he quit the band right before their debut album, which is what tragically sort of opened the door for Varg to come in, become close to Oystein, develop a bitter rivalry with Oystein, and eventually kill him. And then there's the character of Pelle, a.k.a. Dead, who was the lead singer of Mayhem for a few years. And he's another one who sort of embodies the art, but in a very different way, where someone like Varg perpetrates the actions of a dark mind upon others. Pelle lived darkness through his own experience. It was no accident that he called himself Dead. All of these guys had nicknames, but his is in many ways the most succinct and spot on. He'd actually been considered dead for a few minutes as a teenager who was beaten nearly to death by bullies at his school, leading to a ruptured spleen and a stopped pulse. And after that event, he suffered from a sort of sense of almost disconnect between his mind and his body, as if he'd already died. His lyrics speak to wondering what the journey would be like to go to the other side, to go into the world of death voluntarily. And his obsession with death extended even to things like inhaling the stench of dead animals before going on stage, and the wearing of corpse paint when he was performing. All of this was, in a way, bringing himself into contact with the idea of death as closely as possible. And of course, in his case, that led not to him committing violence on others, but on himself. He committed suicide before their first album could be released. It was Oystein, a.k.a. Euronymous, who discovered his body, and Oystein's response as the polemicist of the movement was to go and buy a disposable camera. People didn't have cell phones with cameras in those days. And to take pictures of Pelle's dead body. Those eventually became widely shared and hugely notorious. They're still out and available to this day, in spite of the distress that it causes Pelle's friends and family, his surviving younger brother. And the plan in Oystein's mind was even to use the most horrifying of these images as the cover of an album. This is what led Necrobutcher to leave the band. For him, that firewall between dark music and a lived life didn't have headspace in it for working with someone who would actually exploit their friend's suicide so blatantly as a polemical device. It's been an interesting journey learning about these guys and learning about the other musicians around them. Fascinating characters, people like Blackthorn, aka Snorre Ruth, who was in a two-man band called Thorns, both of whom ended up in prison. The drummer for murdering a man in Lillehammer, and Snorre for his role in the murder of Oystein as an accomplice to Varg. But very interesting musicians, and watching the official Norwegian documentary on the history of black metal, he's one of the more interesting characters in it, partly because he seems so musically motivated as opposed to motivated by politics or religion or hatred of religion, as so many of the others are. And he cites numerous classical influences on his own music, for instance, the music of Prokofiev in particular, the Montagues and Capulets from the Romeo and Juliet suite. And figures like Olivier Messiaen, who is an interesting one to influence the world of black metal, because after all, Messiaen's one of the most Christian of all composers, and yet his music is in its own way very, very extreme. Classical music need not concede anything to black metal in terms of its capability of expressing extremes of experience, extremes of darkness. And for me, as someone who's a classical music practitioner, I've seen time and time again the impact that extreme music can have on classical audiences. It's interesting because one of Oystein's tenets, not in a way so different from those of Pierre Boulez, is that you had to be all in or all out with this worldview of extreme darkness, that you couldn't, easily go from, say, listening to the Beatles to listening to the music of Mayhem or Dark Throne or Celtic Frost, any of these early bands. That's a familiar trope amongst many of my friends who are practitioners of more abstract or challenging forms of contemporary music. And likewise, there's a huge contingent of music lovers who have absolutely no interest in listening to extreme music and listening to music that goes so close to the void, to the point that you would almost think that this is an impossible thing to do, to hold these divergent worlds in our heads. And yet performers do it all the time. That one day as a violinist or a guitarist, you might be playing the most extreme, twisted music imaginable, and the next day you're playing Mozart or the Bee Gees. Does that in some way mean that you're not doing justice to one or the other? It's hard to say. One could ask, for instance, an actor if the definition of a great performance is one in which the performance is the most convincing, or the one in which the experience of the performer was the closest to the reality of the events being depicted. This is an old argument that goes across many, many art forms. I'm reminded in the case of Pelle, aka Dead, of the case of the great German composer Bernd Alois Zimmermann, who was one of the most powerful and communicative contemporary composers of post-war Germany. Zimmermann was in some ways considered a bit of an outlier in the world of high modernism, because he didn't want to follow down the road of post-Webern total abstraction. His music always has a visceral element to it. And where that post-Webern movement, including Boulez, also sought to distance their music from vernacular music in the same way that black metal musicians wanted to make their landscape of music very self-contained, alien, remote, and distant by taking out waltzes, marches, and vernacular music of all kinds. Classical music has a way of making itself desolate, remote, arid, forbidding, something that a polemicist like Boulez very much wanted. And then in the case of Zimmermann, you have someone whose attraction to darkness is very profound, and his ability to depict darkness, violence, depravity in his music is almost unmatched. And at his fingertips, he had the whole world of serial technique, of all the post-Schoenberg modernist tropes of orchestration, of technique, and in his own way, pushing those into new territories, but at the same time, keeping the doors open to things like vernacular music. In a way, he was a polystylistic composer before Alfred Schnittke coined the phrase, incorporating Negro spirituals and jazz, for instance, into his very dark, quintessentially Germanic world. His great masterpiece is the opera Die Soldaten. Based on a play from the 1700s, from the Sturm und Drang movement. But in Zimmermann's score, he says these events take place yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So one of the things he wanted to be able to evoke and elicit in his artwork was a sense of simultaneity across different time streams, of musical events unfolding then, now, and in the future. And he does this in the opera in very compelling and powerful ways. In fact, one of his original concepts for the opera was that there should be 12 stages at once. Be fascinating to see what that looks like in person, what it's like to experience that kind of onslaught. Interesting that he chose such an old play as the basis of this work, because it goes as dark into the human psyche as you can imagine. One can't help but think also that this is a work that could only have been written after 2 world wars, and yet the play on which it's based and on which he's incredibly faithful to, it's the darkness it describes is terrifying and disturbing. It's a work full of violence, rape, depravity, degradation, and at its heart, it's this sense of the way in which war and society dehumanizes and degrades us. It's music of violent protest. I think it's something that the black metal guys would have quite related to. Zimmermann was ultimately very much a character like Dead, like Pele, in that he became more and more incapable of separating the darkness in his work from the darkness in his own emotional life. And like Pele, he committed suicide really at the peak of his powers as a musician, just days after completing one of his most important musical works. Why do we find music of extremity and music of darkness and art of darkness so compelling? Is it something that's inherently niche, that's only for an audience of a select few? Is it something that should remain only for a select few? Is there a danger in engaging with the darkest of art? I'm reminded of the classic Japanese horror film Ringu, or The Ring, in which there's a videotape which, once watched, leaves you with a curse. And the curse is that you will die within 7 days, horrifically. And it turns out that at the end of the story, the only way that you can avoid the curse is to make a copy of the tape and to share it with someone. And this reminds me so much of the early days of the black metal movement. Everything on cassette tapes being shared and mailed out to listeners across the world. But is it a line that once crossed you can't cross back on? Is engaging with this very dark and forbidding music putting one inexorably on the path of someone like a Varg Vikernes? Or is it music and art that, like anything else, we can hit pause on, we can hit rewind, we can take it out of the cassette player and put on a bit of Mozart or a bit of the Beatles? For different people, the answer to that question will be different. And I would say that we need not be intimidated by the forcefulness of the polemicists who would tell us that it's all or nothing, that you have to live this yourself or not listen to it. At the end of the day, we live in a dark and violent world. We will all die one day. There's a good reason why Halloween is such a popular holiday for so many people, why the Day of the Dead is such a important celebration in so many cultures. Death is one of the few things that unites us all. And from Grimm's fairy tales through Mayhem, Darkthorn, and beyond, art and storytelling that helps us come to terms with the proximity of darkness is incredibly important, I think, in allowing us to live our lives in a measured state of awareness, but not mortal terror. And in that sense, I think that's one of the reasons why mainstream audiences actually really gravitate towards this. So this is a theme I plan to continue to explore. And if you've enjoyed this, let me know. And maybe I'll do a follow-up or two. I'm going to make a playlist of some of the artists and music that I've talked about in this episode. And I hope you've enjoyed it and found it interesting. And happy Halloween, everyone.
Mr. Potato Head! Mr. Potato Head! Mr. Potato Head! Eyes, ears, feet, mouth, nose, hands, Mr. Potato Head! Driving down the freeway, potato behind the wheel, feeling the beating my machine, the brand new Spudmobile. He didn't notice that the light was red. Let's say a silent prayer for Mr. Potato Head. So tell me, Doctor, how bad is he? I can take it.
Well, Mrs. Potato Head, I'm afraid it doesn't look very good, because if your husband does survive the operation, he's going to be a vegetable for the rest of his life.